Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the final episode of the Daily Friends Show for 2022. It always sounds kind of weird to say because I feel like the 2020s should be in the future, not now. But anyway, we're at the end of it. We're heading onwards to 2023. Today's the last day of November, and tomorrow's the first day of December, and the beginning, I think, of most people's slowdown for the year. But joining us on our last episode of the year, we have Dr. John Endres. John, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you, Nicholas, and thanks for having me on again.
Always a pleasure. And of course, Tiego Thotse. Tiego, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing good things, and how are you, sir? Good afternoon, John, sir. Good afternoon to the viewers as well.
I am mostly good, except for that I have a lot of things to do before the year wraps up. But apart from that, I'm in high spirits. All right, so there will be just a notice, a short, not a short, a sort of slightly longer than usual, but not super long, special episode where John and I will talk about the year that's passed and the year that's ahead. So that'll be our kind of special wrap up of the year. We did one last year with our former CEO Frans Kronia and John as well. So I think that'll be pretty good. That should be up either this evening or tomorrow. So look out for that one. And yeah, let's get into the news of today. So the first one is, I think, quite an interesting story, which is a new initiative by the city of Johannesburg. Of course, the country's most important city in many, many ways. It is also has some very fraught politics at the moment with a very weak minority coalition holding on to power, trying to keep the ANC out of government. And the coalition government has announced an initiative called the Financial Misconduct Board, which they are hoping to set up soon, presumably before the ANC and EFF can get together to throw them out with a vote of no confidence, which is probably going to happen next year. So they've already adopted some of the measures in council in May and are now looking at independent candidates who they say are going to fill this board. So the board's reason for existence will be to assist the council and city with investigating allegations of financial misconduct, investigate allegations of financial misconduct in the municipality or entities upon receipt of instruction from the council or city manager, prepare and submit reports to the council, the mayoral committee, and city managers as appropriate for each case, provide recommendations of further steps to be taken regarding disciplinary proceedings or other relevant actions to be taken, monitor the institution of disciplinary proceedings against an alleged transgressor. Mayor Paul Palazzo said, at the adoption of the FMB, that being the Financial Misconduct Board, that council recognizes the shortcomings of the former disciplinary board to fight and eradicate nefarious acts by city officials and eliminates the confusion between the Financial Misconduct Board and other disciplinary structures within the city. An interesting move, and I wonder if it's one that we can might see at least rolled out to other non-ANC governed municipalities around the country. John, let me start with you. What's your take on this? Do you think this is a good idea? It's a little bit strange to create this sort of parallel structure on the side to deal with disciplinary issues and misconduct, corruption. What do you think is the game plan here?
Yeah, I'm sort of cautiously positive about it. Because what I'm seeing happening is that if you imagine yourself to be an honest and good manager in a municipality or an SOE or some other organ of state who wants to improve the organization and its output, its effectiveness, but you find yourself surrounded by people that you can't really trust, who you think might be involved in some shady business, or they're not performing. So you're a bit stuck. Your intentions might be entirely honorable, and you might really want to do the right thing, but you might be, just not be able to do it because there are too many people around you that you cannot trust. And so I think what this board does is that it creates a slightly parallel structure that will hopefully be staffed with people who are independent and external to the administration, and that will take a very hard look at the conduct of city officials and are able to take steps when misconduct is identified. And what I also find intriguing about this is the notion that in many cities, what we've heard is that a reason for underperformance under coalition governments is that the administration, the officials don't cooperate. They maybe sabotage the efforts of the new administration. And it's very difficult to manage them out because the labor protections are so extensive. And so this kind of financial misconduct board might be a mechanism to assist and support the disciplinary processes in order to get the underperforming members out and get better people to come in, as well, of course, as putting the fear of God into the people who are not performing and who are stealing the money. So I think it's a good initiative. Remains to be seen if it works or not, but it looks encouraging at first glance. Nick?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that, one of the big problems that these municipalities seem to have is that the corruption and patronage networks are really embedded into the DNA of the city's officialdom and into its enforcement procedures. In my short time in government, but I'm sure every South African knows this, is that it's basically impossible to get fired from government. I remember that I think there were some city power workers who during a strike may have sabotaged some power infrastructure in Joburg and caused an outage a few years ago. They were all suspended for a time and then I think put back to work. In fact, I think the suspension was even with pay. So that's been kind of the typical disciplinary culture up till now. So as you say, I'm not sure if this idea is necessarily going to work, but I think it's definitely moving in the right direction, that you really need to actually sharpen up your disciplinary procedures and processes if you want to actually start cleaning up some of these cities. Tiego, what's your take on all this?
No, I agree with everything that John has said. I agree with everything you have said as well. That we do, if you are going to deal with corruption at local government level, you do have to sharpen your disciplinary measures indeed. But I do think that whereas this is good from a governance perspective, there is something still missing that without you cannot ensure the sustainability of this, and that is the civil society, right? Without an active civil society sector there in Johannesburg that's going to ensure that this board does its job, that's going to ensure that the right people are appointed, that's going to ensure that the council runs its affairs very well, hold the politicians, officials, and people part of this board accountable, chances are that, say, you could have this working for a bit of a while, you have a next cohort of politicians elected, they bring in corrupt people to the board and everything. So it does have some gaps, and those gaps can only really be filled by the civil society sector. So whereas this is very good and welcome, I think you do need residents themselves to start rising up to the occasion as well, holding these boards to account, holding the councils to account, and so forth and on. Otherwise, this just might not be sustainable as well. Like we've seen many other procedures being brought in at different levels of government, from province to national, not working out simply because the people who are meant to implement them don't implement them and there's no one running after them.
I think that's a really good point because, considering the weakness of this coalition government in terms of the number of votes it has in council, I would not be surprised if by the time this board is finalized, the current government is out and the old government is back in power. Maybe this time with a few of its own coalition partners. But, then there's probably going to be a move to scrap said board or to subordinate it to the old disciplinary board or to rework it in some way. And if it is indeed doing good work, and hopefully we'll be able to see that sooner rather than later, it's going to be important for civil society to put pressure on the government and say, hey, no, this is actually a good thing. Don't get rid of it. John, any final thoughts on this story?
Well, maybe just that this establishes possibly a solution approach, an experiment that we'll see across other municipalities as well, and other areas. And I'm thinking here particularly of Cape Town's LEAP law enforcement program, which is sort of a flanking organization to the police, and helps to fight crime, but is parallel, and by all accounts quite successful. So you might see these parallel structures beginning to emerge where you've got some state-mandated organization that is pretty useless, and something that gets built in parallel by an opposition coalition, for example, or by the private sector, and that is effective. And hopefully, that will then turn into the nucleus of something that becomes a more capable state one day in the future.
No, I agree. That's definitely the right way to go. But it's also probably going to be quite bumpy because you can imagine the fights for influence between these competing organizations that we're going to have in the future. And in fact, we're already seeing it with the LEAP program and the SAPS, I think, in the Cape a bit. But anyway, something very interesting to watch, and I think a big development that we may see only accelerating as we head towards 2024. All right. Let us move on to our next story. And this is, well, some good news for a change, which is that South Africa's unemployment rate seems to have decreased by 1 percentage point in the last quarter. About 204,000 jobs were created between the second and third quarter, and the number of employed people is around 15.8 million. On the expanded definition, there was also a very slight decrease in the unemployment rate. It wasn't just the official definition, which I'm not a statistician, so I don't fully understand why we embrace the official definition as the official one. The expanded seems more useful, but anyway. Interestingly about this, if you dive into the numbers of where the jobs were picked up, manufacturing, construction, and transport recorded the largest job gains. Now, that's interesting because those have been the sectors that have really been shedding jobs over the last couple of quarters, as we've seen the unemployment rate grow to the highest it's ever been. And the sectors that normally do well, in this case, namely finance, were actually lost some jobs in this quarter. And when it comes to the provinces that are worst affected, Northwest and Eastern Cape, they have expanded unemployment rates of above 50%. So basically half of all adults who want to work are unemployed in those provinces. And the situation remains pretty bad across the whole of the country. Interestingly, it looks like the majority of the jobs created were amongst people between the ages of, I think, 35 and 44, which is quite bizarre because that's not normally where you'd see a lot of people entering the workforce. And I think that suggests that there might be something misleading in this reduction in unemployment figures. Because, of course, as we know, there hasn't been a lot of the reforms that are necessary to get unemployment under control. Some business analysts who were asked about this, said that unless South African GDP growth hits around 3%, we're not really going to see major reductions in the unemployment rate going forward. Tiego, your thoughts on the unemployment crisis?
Well, my thoughts around the unemployment crisis would firstly be that we have a government, first and foremost, that has been around since 1994 till today, that does not really understand what it's doing. I think this was a political movement. Of course, African National Congress was a movement pre-1994. They came into 1994 and people elected them based on the experience they had in the movement. They came into governance and there wasn't much progress, although under Thabo Mbeki in particular, you did see some progress in terms of employment going up and a bit of growth coming about in our economy. But the reality of the matter is that at the time that the African National Congress government was doing a bit well during Mbeki's time, it wasn't even so much the ANC in and of itself that got us to that progress. It was individuals such as Mbeki himself, individuals such as Joel Nechitenze inside the African National Congress against many times what the ANC itself stands for. The ANC itself stands for really socialism a lot of times, and there's no way that you can create sustainable jobs with that ideology. But it's a discussion we'll touch on another time, I think, around why really I reckon that you cannot create jobs from that ideology. But fundamental to it is that creators of socialism, your Karl Marxes and everyone else, were not real scholars, right? They were more of analysts and people who shared their opinions, emotions, what could happen in the future without basing it on evidence and scientific stuff and stuff of that nature. Now you have a government that subscribes to such people who are not necessarily real scholars, who are more of analysts whose work was not based on science. We have an African National Congress that subscribes to these people's policies that, for obvious reasons, because they are not based on science, cannot produce the kind of jobs that we need in the country. So fundamental to the unemployment crisis in South Africa are the policies that we have in place, policies such as BEE, policies, high taxes, for example, that, I mean, as an investor, if I was to invest in a country and South Africa versus a country with lower taxes, I would invest elsewhere. So things such as high taxes that are created by this welfare state that we have, a state that's constantly giving. We are giving people 350s. We are giving people money for basically making children, in my opinion. Like I've mentioned, you find people having around 9 or 11 children that we are funding. It's money being wasted there that's being collected through taxes that could have otherwise not been collected from the businesses that could have created jobs and stuff of that nature. So fundamentally, it's policies. But yeah, it's a discussion I think we can have at a much later stage in a lengthier issue.
So, John, the big question is, I suppose, when it comes to something, when you see some good news like more people getting work, is this trend going to continue? And already, a lot of the sort of analysts, other mainstream analysts, have poured cold water on this and said, yeah, we're probably not going to see major gains. Firstly, do you agree with that? And secondly, why did we see a reduction, do you think, in the unemployment in this quarter?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true that we encounter so much doom and gloom that we are quite taken aback when we have a bit of good news to share. And I think we must enjoy this brief moment and say it is actually, this is good news. If you're creating 1.48 million jobs over the course of a year, that is good. And we must recognize that. But I also think what we've seen is the analysts scrambling to find an explanation. So certainly this, wasn't what economists expected. And they're also battling to explain it because they say, looking at all the fundamental data, all the things that explain how jobs created, really none of those things is present. So why are jobs being created? And I think the closest they've come to an explanation so far is that it is a kind of very delayed bounce back, where other countries after COVID sort of restored the number of jobs that they had lost pretty quickly. South Africa was very slow in doing that. And as a matter of fact, may still be busy doing that because the labor markets are quite rigid.
I think we're still below our employment figures from before the pandemic.
Yeah. We're still about over 600,000 jobs below where we were in the fourth quarter of 2019, sorry. So yeah, we haven't regained all the jobs that we lost. And then, of course, we also lost jobs because of the July riots and the April flooding in KZN. So for all sorts of reasons, jobs have been going away for a long time. And some of them are now coming back. And that is, welcome, but it is very slow. And I think ultimately the skeptical economists are going to turn out to be right, which is that the fundamentals aren't in place for these kinds of improvements to be sustained. And one of those factors, of course, includes economic growth. I think it's true. If you've got low growth, you're not going to create jobs sustainably. And our growth is now forecast at 1.1% for next year by the Reserve Bank. I think the Treasury still has a slightly higher growth rate of 1.4% or 1.6% in its forecasts. But either way, it is below where it needs to be to create jobs. And it's probably going to stay low because of the electricity cuts and because the global economy is also, it looks like it's slowing down. So I think it's pretty safe to assume that, unfortunately, this good news is a bit of a flash in the pan. It was a nice thing, which we must savor while it lasts. But I don't think that we're going to see unemployment coming down sustainably, unfortunately.
Tiego, any final thoughts before we move on?
Well, my final thoughts would be that I totally agree with John that this is something to be celebrated. And I would speak particularly, say, to an industry such as the manufacturing industry. Why did we see growth in there? I think I'm not quite certain, but as I was listening to John, I thought that it's probably given that after the whole lockdowns and everything, you had mines, for example, going back to mining and stuff of that nature, and therefore manufacturing companies having material to work with, getting back into the industry and working again. I think I agree with John that it was a surprise for everyone, including the government of the day. I don't think they themselves were expecting this, because this was not out of anything special that they did. This happened because, there had been a stop and it had to continue. But it's not that they did anything magically or anything special to get us to where we are. What would get us forth and get us to move in a sustainable manner is having the right policies in place and being able to create an environment that will inspire confidence in investors. Currently, South Africa does not do that.
Right, and that's exactly what we need to turn around. Okay, let us move to a different part of the country now. And there was recently a socioeconomic development discussion hosted by people from the involved with the Zulu royal household and the Zulu kingdom. and they have announced that there's going to be a partnership formed between AfriForum and the Ingonyama Land Trust. The idea here, according to a professor who was in attendance of the conference, Professor Kulu, said, there are tracts of underutilized Ingonyama land, so we're trying to put together our thinking about how we can mobilize the Amakosi to be economic development agents and champions. The Amakosi should have development committees rather than just having Amabuto. Amabuto are not productive, they are cultural. So why are we not converting that energy into participation in farming and partner with knowledgeable organizations like AfriForum to become more productive so you have food security in your household? And they said that their long-term game was to achieve economic freedom. AfriForum, for their part, their CEO, Kali Creel, said that the organization will play an advisory role to communities and would not be involved as shareholders. He said, quote, we are not trying to come in and run it because we know the strength lies in communities. Our role will be more facilitating and giving advice. We must remember in all communities that there are shining stars, so we need to advise people in community who take responsibility, and ownership has to be by the community. He then went on to say, if you look at Afrikaner mistakes, the communities looked after themselves way back in our history during British rule. Then during the apartheid system, Afrikaners became reliant on the government, and we had to go back to our roots and say, we need to take responsibility for our own future. John, what do you make of this? I think politically, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here, right? Because AfriForum is clearly trying to build an alliance of other organizations and institutions in the country, so that it doesn't feel, I think, so isolated as it often probably feels on the political battlefield. What do you make of this, and do you think that we're going to see real results from it?
I think it's a very on-brand kind of thing to do for AfriForum. So that's about minorities, and of course the Zulu, despite being a very large group, are a minority in South Africa, as are the Afrikaners. And this is sort of the idea of getting the minorities to each do their thing, but work together in order to strengthen their own part of the country. So it's a little bit of an opposite to the melting pot idea. I think, as we experience it living in Johannesburg, people come here from all over the place, all over South Africa, all over Africa, all over the world. So this kind of thing probably wouldn't quite work in Johannesburg. But where you have sort of concentrated, culturally homogenous groups, you can do it. And AfriForum, I think, has demonstrated quite a lot of successes in doing that for the Afrikaner community. They have, on occasion, also extended their hand to other groups and helped out. And this seems to be, I think, a continuation of that approach. What I find interesting here is that I think that the Zulu nation is probably quite distinct in many ways within the South African context, in that it has maybe few hang-ups about interacting with whites and Afrikaners. You had the wars in the 1800s, which were brutal, but in which both sides, I think, acquitted themselves honorably and left the battleground with their heads held high. And so I think for the Zulu, it is not a difficult thing to engage with the Afrikaners in the sense and say, look, we want to be self-determined. We want to make things work for our community. We realize that the state is getting weaker. We can't really rely on it to help us. So we want to help our people. And that is where AfriForum comes in. Whether it's going to be effective or not is another question. It's I think at this stage impossible to say if this is a flag-waving exercise. It makes good headlines and looks really interesting, or whether it is going to be something substantial that carries on over time and makes a tangible difference in the lives of many people in KwaZulu-Natal. Nick.
So Tiego, we've had this discussion a little bit before about how you're not so keen on some of our traditional leaders in general, and I think there's a lot of good on a sort of practical level to be said maybe about, you see, kind of cooperation like this, knowledge sharing, that sort of stuff. But fundamentally, the problem remains here that the Ingonyama Trust is essentially state land that is parceled out and held by chiefs, and that there's very little private ownership. And, as liberals, we tend to think that things work better when people own them for themselves. So I'm not sure even if you have all of the goodwill, knowledge, and best efforts in the world, that this is really going to see major results without proper private ownership of land. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts around this, Nick, would be that for so long as the land is in the hands of the Ingonyama Trust, we could say that to an extent, this is a good move. But to begin with, the land shouldn't be in their hands, like you've mentioned. The land should be in the hands of the state and the people. But more than anything, it shouldn't even be on the state's hands. Much of it should be on the people's hands than even on the state's hands. My concern, whereas I think in the current situation, given that the land is in their hands right now, you have people who are not working in the KZN and stuff of that nature. And it's something that I've always questioned, that why do we have kings? Why do we pay kings as the government, yet they do nothing? They're in charge of this land that they are currently in charge of. They are not driving any economic activities on their lands, many of them, such as in Limpopo. All they do is to demand tenders from the government and stuff of that nature, but they could be attracting investments into their villages and stuff of that nature, attracting investments onto the lands that they own. But I do think that this is not sustainable at all, even though it is good in the current context in a way. It's not sustainable at all, the same way that this thing of kings is not sustainable, because it relies on who you have as a king. So perhaps this could work out now with the current king that you have. You have a progressive KZN, many jobs coming in and everything of that nature, even though they do own the land. Then tomorrow you wake up with a king whose head does not work at all. Then the people must suffer simply because someone who was not wiser like the other one was now born. It's not sustainable. Rather, leave the whole thing in the hands of the people, give people title deeds, let the people themselves, to an extent, be in charge of their successfulness in life or not. Don't put it on an individual. Today you have a good leader, gets the economy running, everyone is fine. Tomorrow you have someone with a head that's not working, then everyone must suffer because of those consequences. That's not good at all. And I think the same argument is the same argument that we make things for stuff such as the police in South Africa, that it would be good to decentralize the power that's around there, take it to provinces, take it to local municipalities, because you don't want power to be at this one place whereby if a few individuals or one person fails at that very helm of the whole structure, then everyone must face the consequences of that. So it's not sustainable at all. I agree with John.
So, John, I suspect that, in light of what Tiego said about how, there's this concern about land, and we've seen it at the, an ANC, there was an ANC panel which suggested that Ingonyama land be given to, it was headed by Kotlemo Motlanthe, be given to people who work it. So I wonder if perhaps what's driving the people associated with the Ingonyama Trust here to try and make the land more productive is precisely because they fear having it taken from them either by the state or given to some of the people who work it. Do you have any final thoughts on this?
Yeah, maybe a historical reference to Venezuela, where a socialist government came in 2000, and the very first thing they targeted for expropriation was what they call tierras ociosas, which means idle lands. So in other words, you start gently, not with expropriating a productive mine or a bank, but you say, look, there's all this land all over the place that nobody's working. It just belongs to someone. Wouldn't it be better for the state to have it? And so those lands get expropriated. But once you've started, then the next step is that you say, well, those were the idle lands, but now we must look at the underutilized lands. So, you've got 5 cows on your piece of land, but you could actually fit 100 cows on that piece of land. So let the state take it, and we'll put 100 cows on, and it will be much better. And then you move step by step all the way up to expropriating cement factories and oil industries and banks and mines and so on in the end. So it's a really creeping, dangerous process. And maybe this is what the Zulu are trying to head off by saying, let's just make sure we don't have too much idle land lying around that might be eyed covetously by the government. Nick.
Interesting to think about. But that is all the time we have for the podcast today. Thank you, everyone, for the year. It's been fantastic. We've seen great growth in our numbers. And we'd love to keep you with us next year. We hope that we can keep entertaining and delighting you into the next year and informing you about stuff that's going on in the country and giving our perspective on what we think should be done to fix things. like I said, there will be a special with me and John, just talking about the year ahead and the year past. So do look out for that, which will be up on both the audio platforms and our YouTube channel. Our Cliff Central listeners will need to head to our YouTube channel to check that out. But yeah, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful year. And we will see you next year on, I think, the 9th of January is when our first episode back is going to be. I may be slightly off by only a few days on that one. But anyway, have a great holiday. Have a happy Christmas. Whatever holidays you may be celebrating or may not be celebrating, enjoy. And we'll see you next year on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.